Chapter 6, Predestination. Theological controversy over predestination has caused great confusion in the religious lives of many people. In the Bible, we find many passages which are often interpreted to mean that everything in an individual's life comes to pass exactly as predestined by God. Yet we can find sufficient evidence in the Bible to refute the doctrine of absolute predestination. How can the principle solve this problem? Section 1, the predestination of God's will. God could not accomplish his purpose of creation due to the human fall. Accordingly, God's will is still to accomplish the purpose of creation. In this sense, God's will is that restoration be accomplished. God is the absolute being, unique, eternal, and unchanging. Therefore, his will must also be absolute, unique, eternal, and unchanging. God's predestination of his will is absolute. The predestination of the way in which God's will is fulfilled. Although God's will is of the providence of restoration, is absolute and beyond human influence, its fulfillment necessarily requires the accomplishment of the human portion of responsibility. God predestines the process of its fulfillment conditionally, contingent upon the 5% responsibility of the central figure, which must be completed in addition to the 95% responsibility of God. The proportion of 5% is used to indicate that the human portion of responsibility is extremely small when compared to God's portion of responsibility. Yet for human beings, this 5% is equivalent to 100% of our effort. The predestination of the fulfillment of God's will is conditional. The predestination of human beings. If a person does not complete his responsibility, he cannot become the person God has purposed him to be. Hence, predestination of human beings is conditional. God's providence of salvation begins from one point and gradually expands to cover the whole. Therefore, in the providence of salvation, God first predestines one person to be the central figure and then calls him to a mission. What qualifications should the person possess to merit such a calling? He must be born into the chosen people. He must come from an ancestral line with many good accomplishments. He must be endowed with the requisite character, and he must develop the necessary qualities during his earthly life. He must live in a time and place most fitting to God's need. Elucidation of biblical verses which support the doctrine of absolute predestination. The book of Romans says, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined. Those whom he predestined, he also called. And those whom he called, he also justified. And those whom he justified, he also glorified." Romans 8:29 through 30. God predestines those whom he foreknows. Then he calls upon him to fulfill the purpose of the providence. Calling the person is God's responsibility, but only when the person completes his responsibility after being called by God is he justified and then glorified. Because the biblical verse does not mention the human portion of responsibility, people may misinterpret it to mean that all affairs are determined solely by God's absolute predestination.